The thermometer outside read -38 degrees, but inside Lars Henriksen's strange half-buried shelter, he sat in his shirt sleeves while the temperature held steady at 52 degrees. What neighbors had called Henriksen's metal grave would change how people survived on the northern plains for the next 40 years. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story is even more remarkable than this one. The land stretched flat and endless under a sky so vast it seemed to curve at the edges. Lars Henriksen stood beside the wagon, his younger brother Emil at his side, and looked across the quarter section they had claimed under the Homestead Act. It was April of 1878, and they had just completed a journey of 900 miles from Wisconsin to the Dakota Territory. The soil was black and rich when Lars dug his boot heel into it, deep prairie loam that had never seen a plow. Grass grew thick enough that it brushed his knees when he walked through it. A small creek ran along the western boundary of their claim, fed by springs that ensured water even in dry summers. The location was everything they had hoped for when they filed their claim at the land office in Yankton 3 months earlier. Emil was 22 years old, 4 years younger than Lars. He had their father's build, broad-shouldered and strong, ideal for the work ahead. Lars was taller and leaner, but both brothers had grown up on a Wisconsin farm and understood what homesteading required: breaking prairie, planting crops, building shelter, surviving until the land could support them. They had arrived with practical resources: 2 horses, a wagon loaded with tools and supplies, seed wheat for spring planting, a few chickens in crates, and $40 in cash remaining from what they had saved working Wisconsin lumber camps during the previous winter. It was enough to start, barely, if they were careful and lucky. The first priority was shelter. They had canvas for temporary cover, but Dakota winters were legendary. Every homesteader they had spoken with during the journey north had emphasized the same thing. Winter killed more settlers than any other factor. Not Indians, not accidents, not disease, but simple cold. Temperatures dropped to 30 and 40 degrees below zero. Blizzards lasted for days. Wind was constant and merciless. Most homesteaders built dugouts as first shelters. The construction was straightforward: dig into a hillside or excavate a rectangular pit, use the excavated earth to form walls, frame a roof with whatever timber was available, cover it with sod. The result was crude but functional, and it could be completed in a week or 2 with hard work. Lars and Emil spent their first 3 days on the claim cutting sod bricks and stacking them into a temporary shelter barely large enough to sleep in. It kept rain off while they worked. Then they began planning their dugout. They selected a site on a low rise near the creek where the soil was stable and drainage would be good. They began digging. The dugout Lars and Emil built that first summer followed standard homesteader practice. They excavated into the hillside, creating a space 14 feet wide, 16 feet deep, and 7 feet high at the front, sloping to 5 feet at the back. The earth walls provided insulation and protection from wind. They framed the front wall with cottonwood logs hauled from the creek bottom, the only timber available within 5 miles. The front wall was the critical element. It had to support the roof, contain a door and small window, and protect the interior from weather. Lars and Emil chinked between the logs with prairie clay mixed with grass. They built a door from split cottonwood planks. The window was covered with oiled paper, the only transparent material they could afford. For the roof, they laid more cottonwood poles across the span and covered them with layers of prairie grass, then sod bricks, creating a living roof that would insulate and shed water. The construction took 3 weeks. By late May, they had shelter that would allow them to focus on breaking prairie and planting their first crop. The dugout was dark inside, even at midday, and the dirt floor stayed damp, but it was substantially better than the canvas tent they had been living under. Summer passed in endless work. They broke 8 acres of prairie using a borrowed plow and their 2 horses. The roots were so dense that progress measured in fractions of acres per day. They planted wheat in the broken ground, knowing the first year's crop would be poor but necessary. They hauled water, tended chickens, hunted prairie chickens and rabbits for meat, and improved their dugout with small refinements. Fall brought their first harvest. The wheat yielded poorly, as expected from first-year breaking, but it was enough to provide seed for the next spring and a small amount to sell. They prepared for winter by stockpiling firewood hauled from the creek bottom, a labor-intensive process given the scarcity of trees. They insulated gaps in the front wall with additional clay and grass. They felt reasonably prepared. Winter arrived in early November, with temperatures dropping steadily. The dugout stayed warmer than outside, but the front wall leaked cold air through gaps that appeared as the wood dried and contracted. Moisture condensed on the earth walls and ceiling, creating a perpetually damp environment. They burned wood constantly to maintain tolerable temperatures, and even then, the interior rarely exceeded 40 degrees. In January of 1879, Emil developed a cough. Within a week, it had progressed to pneumonia. Lars did everything possible, keeping the fire burning continuously, giving Emil their warmest blankets, but the dugout's cold, damp environment worked against recovery. On January 23, 1879, Emil died. He was 22 years old. Lars buried his brother on the hillside above the dugout when the ground thawed enough to dig. He spent the rest of that winter alone, and during those long, dark months, a realization formed that would consume him. The shelter had killed Emil as surely as the disease. Spring came, but Lars found no relief in the warming weather. He maintained the farm mechanically, planting his second wheat crop, tending his animals, but his thoughts remained fixed on the dugout and what it had failed to provide. He began observing his shelter with the critical attention of someone looking for answers rather than accepting circumstances. The front wall was deteriorating. The cottonwood logs, exposed to weather on the exterior and moisture from inside, were beginning to rot. The chinking had cracked and fallen out in places. The oiled paper window had torn during winter storms and now flapped uselessly. The door had warped, leaving gaps that no amount of adjustment could eliminate. The entire front wall system, barely a year old, was already failing. Lars visited neighboring homesteaders that spring and summer, ostensibly for social calls, but actually to examine their shelters. He found the same problems everywhere. Dugouts with front walls, made from whatever timber could be found, all showing signs of rot, all leaking air, all damp inside. Some homesteaders had been on their claims for 3 or 4 years and were on their second or third front wall reconstruction. He talked to a Norwegian family, the Thorstads, who lived 6 miles east. Gunnar Thorstad showed Lars his dugout, which had a front wall that had completely collapsed the previous spring under the weight of wet snow on the roof. Gunnar had rebuilt it, but the new wall was already showing the same deterioration patterns. Gunnar accepted this as normal. Dugouts required constant maintenance. That was simply how frontier life worked. Lars couldn't accept it. He started analyzing the problem systematically. Wood exposed to moisture rotted. That was inevitable. The front wall of a dugout was always exposed to moisture from rain, snow, and condensation from the temperature differential between inside and outside. No amount of careful construction could prevent wood from eventually failing under these conditions. The structural design was also flawed. Front walls bore the entire weight of the roof. As the wood weakened from rot, the structural integrity of the entire shelter was compromised. Several homesteaders Lars spoke with had experienced partial roof collapses when front wall logs gave way. Temperature control was another failure point. Even with the insulation provided by earth on 3 sides and the roof, the front wall allowed significant heat loss. Cold air infiltrated through gaps. The single-layer construction of logs and chinking provided minimal insulation compared to the earth walls. Maintaining livable temperatures required constant fire and substantial fuel consumption. Lars spent evening hours that summer calculating how much wood he burned. In a typical winter month, he estimated he had burned approximately half a cord of wood. Over a 5-month winter, that was 2.5 cords. Gathering that much wood from the scattered cottonwoods along the creek required weeks of labor. In August of 1879, Lars rode to the nearest town, a railroad settlement called Chamberlain, 40 miles southeast of his claim. The journey took 2 days. He went to sell his wheat and purchase supplies for the coming winter, but what he found there changed everything he had been thinking about shelter and survival. The Northern Pacific Railroad was pushing west across Dakota Territory. Chamberlain was a supply depot and construction staging point. Trains arrived weekly with materials, equipment, and workers. The town was chaotic, temporary, filled with men moving through to somewhere else. But it was also filled with materials Lars had never seen in such quantities. Near the rail yards, he found stacks of corrugated metal sheets. They were being used for temporary structures, storage buildings, and equipment sheds. The corrugation created a pattern of ridges and valleys that gave the thin metal significant structural strength. Lars had seen corrugated metal before in Wisconsin, used for industrial buildings and warehouses, but never in such abundance or such large sheets. He spent an afternoon watching railroad workers construct a storage shed using the corrugated metal. They didn't build a wooden frame first. Instead, they bent the metal sheets into an arch shape and anchored the edges to wooden sills on the ground. The arch was self-supporting. The curved shape gave the flexible metal enough rigidity to stand without internal bracing. They bolted multiple sheets together, creating a structure that was completed in a single day. Lars was transfixed. The arch shape distributed weight evenly along the curve. Snow and rain would slide off naturally. The metal wouldn't rot, wouldn't be eaten by insects, wouldn't weaken over time. It was everything wood wasn't. He watched as workers covered one completed arch with earth for additional insulation and protection. The structure didn't collapse under the weight. The arch shape held. That evening, Lars spoke with a railroad supervisor named Collins, who was overseeing construction. Lars asked about the metal structures. Collins explained they were based on Quonset hut designs the military had used during the Civil War, though the term Quonset wouldn't become common until much later. The principle was ancient, Collins said. Arches were the strongest structural shape humans had discovered. Lars asked what happened to the metal sheets when the railroad was finished with them. Collins shrugged. Sometimes they were shipped to the next construction site. Sometimes they were left behind or sold as surplus. There were stacks of damaged sheets, bent or torn during handling, that were essentially worthless to the railroad, but still serviceable for less demanding applications. Lars purchased 15 sheets of damaged corrugated metal for $12. They were scratched, dented, and some had tears along the edges, but they were structurally sound. Each sheet was approximately 8 feet long and 3 feet wide. He loaded them carefully in his wagon. Lars returned to his claim with the metal sheets and an idea that had formed during the 2-day journey home. The arch shape could solve the structural problems of dugout front walls, but that was only half of what he had observed. The railroad workers had buried one of their metal arch structures under earth, and it had held. That detail connected to something Lars had noticed during the previous winter, but hadn't fully understood. The temperature inside his dugout, despite all its problems, had been substantially warmer than outside. Even with cold air leaking through gaps in the front wall, even with inadequate fire, the earth walls had provided significant insulation. The back of the dugout, furthest from the front wall, had stayed noticeably warmer than areas near the entrance. The earth itself was holding heat. Lars decided to test this observation methodically. He owned a mercury thermometer he had brought from Wisconsin, a luxury item his mother had given him for monitoring weather. In early September, he began taking temperature readings at different locations and depths. Outside air temperature at midday was 72 degrees. Inside his dugout, away from the door, the temperature was 68 degrees despite no fire burning. He dug a hole 3 feet deep in undisturbed soil away from his dugout. He placed the thermometer at the bottom, covered it loosely with soil, and waited an hour. When he retrieved it, the reading was 61 degrees. He dug deeper to 5 feet and repeated the test. 60 degrees. At 7 feet deep, the temperature was 58 degrees. Over the next month, as autumn progressed and air temperatures dropped, Lars continued his measurements. By mid-October, outside air temperature averaged 45 degrees. At 7 feet underground, the temperature remained at 57 degrees. The Earth was maintaining a constant temperature regardless of air temperature changes above. Lars wasn't educated in geology or thermodynamics, but he understood the practical implications. The Earth at depth didn't freeze in winter or heat up in summer. It stayed relatively constant, somewhere in the 50s year-round. A shelter surrounded by Earth would tend toward that temperature naturally. The problem with standard dugouts wasn't the earth insulation, it was the front wall that broke the thermal envelope and allowed cold air to pour in. He began imagining a different design. What if the front wall was also earth-covered? What if the entire structure was buried except for a small entrance? The metal arch could form the entrance, providing structural strength and weather resistance, but the majority of the shelter would be completely surrounded by Earth's constant temperature. The concept seemed radical, but the physics made sense. Earth insulation on all sides would create a stable internal temperature. With minimal heating, the interior could be maintained at a comfortable level even during the coldest winter. The metal arch entrance wouldn't rot, wouldn't leak, and would require almost no maintenance. The structure could last decades instead of requiring constant repair. Lars spent October refining his plans. He sketched designs in the margins of an old newspaper, calculating dimensions, and trying to visualize how the components would fit together. He measured his corrugated metal sheets carefully, determining how they could be shaped and joined. He selected a new site for construction, a south-facing hillside with good drainage and stable soil. In November, Lars made another trip to Chamberlain. Winter was approaching, and he needed supplies, but he also needed more metal. The 15 sheets he had purchased weren't enough for what he was planning. He needed at least 30 sheets to create an arch large enough for a livable space and to have extra material for reinforcement and the door. At the railroad yards, he found Collins again and explained what he wanted. Collins was skeptical. Using corrugated metal for a buried structure seemed wasteful. The metal would corrode underground, wouldn't it? Lars explained his plan to keep the metal above ground level, using it only for the entrance arch and door while earth covered everything else. Collins considered this and agreed it might work. The railroad had more damaged sheets available. Collins sold Lars 20 additional sheets for $16, bringing his total investment in metal to $28. It was a substantial expense, nearly a third of what Lars had earned from his wheat crop, but he was committed to the design. While in Chamberlain, Lars also purchased items he wouldn't normally have bought. He spent $3 on a roll of tar paper, a waterproofing material used in roof construction. He bought a gallon of boiled linseed oil for $2 to treat the metal and prevent rust. He purchased 60 feet of half-inch hemp rope for $5, planning to use it for pulling the metal sheets into curve. He bought a sheet of mica, a translucent mineral that could be split into thin layers, for $8. It would serve as a window material far superior to oiled paper. His final purchase was controversial. He bought a small cast-iron stove for $15. Most homesteaders built crude fireplaces from fieldstone or used simple fire pits. A manufactured stove was considered an unnecessary luxury. But Lars had studied heat efficiency during his temperature experiments. A properly designed stove with a chimney would produce more heat from less wood than an open fire. The investment would pay for itself in reduced wood-gathering labor. When Lars loaded his wagon for the return trip, other homesteaders at the trading post noticed his purchases. A Swedish farmer named Peterson asked what he was building with all that metal. Lars explained briefly, describing the earth-covered dugout with a metal arch entrance. Peterson looked at the corrugated sheets and shook his head. He told Lars he was wasting money. Earth-covered structures were dark and damp. Metal would rust and collapse. The traditional dugout design had worked for thousands of homesteaders. Why try to reinvent something that already worked adequately? Lars didn't argue. He thanked Peterson for his concern and continued loading. On the journey home, he thought about Peterson's reaction. It was easier to accept traditional methods than to risk time and money on unproven ideas. Most homesteaders were barely surviving. They couldn't afford to experiment. Lars understood that, but he also understood that traditional methods had killed his brother. Lars spent a week in late November studying his land and selecting the optimal location for his new shelter. The decision was more complex than simply finding a hillside to dig into. Multiple factors would determine whether his design succeeded or failed, and he needed to consider them all carefully before breaking ground. The first requirement was drainage. Water was the enemy of any underground structure. If the site allowed water to pool or flow toward the shelter, the interior would flood during spring runoff or heavy rain. Lars walked his property during a rainstorm, watching how water moved across the land. He identified several hillsides where runoff followed predictable channels. He eliminated any site in or near those channels. The second factor was soil composition. Lars needed stable soil that wouldn't collapse during excavation, but also wouldn't be so dense that digging would be impossibly difficult. He used a steel rod to probe soil at various locations, testing depth and consistency. Sandy soil drained well, but lacked structural stability. Heavy clay was stable, but held moisture. He needed something in between. He found what he was looking for on the southwest section of his claim. A gentle hillside rose about 30 feet above the surrounding prairie. The soil was a mixture of clay and loam, stable enough to hold vertical walls during excavation, but workable with basic tools. When he probed with his steel rod, he found no rocks large enough to interfere with digging. The site was above any drainage channels he had identified. The third consideration was sun exposure. Lars wanted southern exposure for two reasons. First, the low winter sun would shine directly on the entrance, providing passive solar heating during the coldest months. Second, southern exposure meant the roof of his shelter would receive maximum sun, helping to melt snow and prevent dangerous accumulation. He oriented his planned structure to face directly south. Wind patterns mattered as well. Dakota winds came predominantly from the northwest during winter, bringing the coldest air and worst blizzards. By building into the hillside with the entrance facing south, the bulk of the hill would block northwestern wind. The entrance would be sheltered from the most severe weather. The final factor was proximity to water. The site Lars selected was 200 yards from the creek, farther than his current dugout. Hauling water uphill would be more work, but the trade-off was worth it for the superior drainage and building conditions the hillside provided. He could carry water. He couldn't fix a shelter built in the wrong location. With the site selected, Lars marked the boundaries of his excavation. He wanted a space 14 feet wide and 20 feet deep, slightly larger than his current dugout. The additional depth would allow the earth covering to extend further over the structure, improving insulation. The 14-foot width matched the curve he could create with his 8-foot metal sheets, allowing for overlap and connection. Lars began digging on December 1, 1879. The timing was poor by conventional standards. Most construction stopped before winter. But Lars wanted the shelter completed before the worst cold arrived, and excavation work would actually generate heat, keeping him warm during the short days. He worked alone, a slow process, but one that allowed him complete control over the quality. He started by removing the topsoil and sod from a rectangle 22 feet wide and 26 feet long, larger than the final interior dimensions to allow for wall thickness and the earth covering. He stacked the sod carefully, planning to reuse it for the roof. The topsoil went into piles on either side of the excavation site. He would need it later for covering the structure. Beneath the topsoil, he encountered the clay loam mixture he had tested. It was dense, but not impossibly hard. He used a pickaxe to loosen the soil and a shovel to remove it. The work was exhausting. Each day he managed to excavate approximately 6 inches of depth across the entire area. At that rate, reaching his target depth of 8 feet would require more than 2 weeks of continuous labor. He dug methodically, creating level terraces as he descended. The terraces allowed him to pile excavated soil temporarily before hauling it out with a bucket. As the hole deepened, he built a simple ramp along one side so he could wheel a barrow in and out. The ramp made removal more efficient, but added to the total excavation volume. By the 10th day, Lars had reached 5 feet of depth. The excavation was large enough now that he could see the space taking shape. The walls were vertical and surprisingly stable. The clay content in the soil provided cohesion. He smoothed the walls with his shovel, removing loose material and creating surfaces that wouldn't crumble. At the back of the excavation where the hillside rose, he began carving into undisturbed earth, creating the rear wall of his shelter. The temperature dropped steadily as December progressed. Morning frost required Lars to break ice on the water bucket before he could drink. But inside the excavation, below ground level, the air was noticeably warmer. At 5 feet deep, the earth provided insulation from wind and held residual warmth. Lars understood he was experiencing exactly what he had measured with his thermometer. The earth's constant temperature was already evident. By December 18th, Lars reached his target depth of 8 feet at the back, sloping to 7 feet at the front, where the entrance would be. The excavation was complete. He had removed approximately 200 cubic yards of earth, representing nearly 3 weeks of continuous labor. His hands were calloused and his back ached constantly, but he had created a space that matched his precise specifications. He spent 2 additional days smoothing and shaping the interior. He carved shallow channels at the base of the walls for drainage, sloping them toward the entrance. He created a level floor by filling low spots with gravel he had hauled from the creek. The result was a beyond precisely dimensioned underground chamber, ready for the next phase of construction. The corrugated metal sheets Lars had purchased were flat. Transforming them into a functional arch required careful planning and significant physical effort. He began by laying out the sheets on level ground near his excavation, studying how they would fit together and determining the optimal curve radius for his design. Each sheet was 8 feet long and 3 feet wide. To create an arch wide enough to span 14 feet, Lars needed to join sheets along their length and curve them into a semicircular shape. He calculated that an arch 14 feet wide would have a radius of 7 feet and a total arc length of approximately 22 feet. That meant he needed to connect 3 sheets lengthwise to create each arch segment. He experimented with joining methods. The corrugations aligned naturally when sheets overlapped by one ridge. He drilled holes through the overlapping sections and bolted them together using 1/4-inch bolts he had purchased in Chamberlain. Each connection required 2 bolts spaced 6 inches apart. The process was tedious, but the resulting joint was rigid and strong. Once he had created several long segments by joining sheets, Lars faced the challenge of bending them into curves. Corrugated metal resisted bending across the corrugations, but flexed relatively easily along them. He oriented his sheets so the corrugations ran lengthwise, perpendicular to the curved direction. This allowed the metal to flex into an arch shape without crimping or collapsing. To create the curve, Lars built a simple wooden form. He drove stakes into the ground in a semicircular pattern matching his desired 7-foot radius. He attached horizontal boards to the stakes, creating a curved template. Then he recruited help from his neighbor Gunnar Thorstad, who had remained skeptical but was willing to assist with heavy work. Together they lifted one of the long metal segments and began forcing it over the wooden form. The metal resisted initially, wanting to remain flat, but as they applied pressure along the length, it gradually conformed to the curve. They secured it temporarily to the form with ropes, allowing the metal to hold its new shape. Lars had painted the metal with boiled linseed oil before bending, and now he painted the interior surface as well, protecting against rust. They repeated this process for additional segments. Lars planned to use 5 full arch segments to create his entrance structure, each one positioned 2 feet behind the previous, creating a tunnel-like entrance 10 feet deep. The multiple layers would provide strength and allow for earth covering without the metal bearing the full weight. With the segments curved and dried, Lars began installing them at the excavation site. He had prepared the entrance area by digging a trench around the perimeter where the arch edges would sit. He set thick wooden sills in the trenches, treating them with linseed oil to prevent rot. The sills would distribute the weight of the arch and earth, covering across a wider area than the thin metal edges alone could manage. He positioned the first arch segment with the edges resting on the sills. The curved shape was self-supporting once in place. He drove wooden wedges between the sill and metal edge to hold the arch firmly. Then he drilled through the metal and sill, bolting them together permanently. The first arch segment was installed. With the first arch segment secured at the entrance, Lars began the delicate process of integrating the metal structure with his excavated dugout. This was the critical innovation that separated his design from both traditional dugouts and the simple metal sheds the railroad built. The metal arch wouldn't stand alone. It would be part of a hybrid structure where metal and earth worked together. He positioned the second arch segment 2 feet behind the first, creating parallel curved walls. Between them, he planned to pack earth and insulation. But first, he needed to connect the arch to the excavated chamber behind it. He had left the front wall of his excavation rough and unfinished specifically for this purpose. Lars carved a curved recess into the earth wall matching the radius of his arch. The recess was 1 foot deep, allowing the rear arch segment to nestle into undisturbed earth. This created a transition zone where the metal structure merged with the earth chamber. He smoothed the junction carefully, ensuring the metal edges would be fully surrounded by soil. Between the arch segments, Lars began packing his insulation system. He started with a layer of dry prairie grass laid lengthwise along the corrugations. The grass provided air pockets that would trap heat. Over the grass, he spread a layer of clay mixed with chopped straw, a mixture he had prepared in advance and kept pliable by covering it with wet burlap. The clay straw layer was 3 inches thick and filled the space between the metal and the earth wall completely. He worked methodically, packing the insulation from bottom to top. At the top of the arch, where the 2 segments met, he overlapped additional metal sheets to create a continuous surface for the earth covering. He bolted these cap pieces carefully, ensuring no gaps where water could penetrate. The process of filling between the arches took 3 full days. Lars checked constantly for voids or soft spots in the packing. Any gap would create a cold pathway that would undermine the entire insulation strategy. He used a wooden rod to probe the packing, ensuring density and continuity throughout. Once the insulation was complete, Lars began the most ambitious part of his design, covering the entire structure with earth. He started at the entrance, piling soil over the metal arch in careful layers. He used the excavated soil he had set aside weeks earlier, selecting material carefully. He avoided large rocks that might damage the metal and excluded topsoil with organic matter that would decompose and settle unevenly. He built up the earth covering in 6-inch layers, tamping each layer firmly before adding the next. The process was similar to adobe construction, creating a solid mass rather than loose fill. The weight accumulated gradually. After the first foot of covering, Lars went inside to check the structure. The metal showed no signs of stress or deformation. The arch shape was distributing the weight exactly as he had hoped. He continued building up the earth covering, extending it back over the excavated chamber. His design called for 2 feet of earth over the entire structure. That thickness would provide substantial insulation while remaining light enough for the arch to support. The entrance required a door system that could seal tightly against cold while remaining accessible from both inside and outside. Lars had watched how heat escaped through gaps in his old dugout door and was determined to create something vastly superior. He began by framing the door opening with heavy timber, creating a rectangular opening 5 feet tall and 2.5 feet wide at the front of his metal arch tunnel. He built the door itself from 3 layers. The outer layer was split cottonwood planks, 3 inches thick, and fitted tightly edge to edge. The middle layer was a sheet of his corrugated metal, cut to size and positioned, with the corrugations running vertically for rigidity. The inner layer was more cottonwood planks running perpendicular to the outer layer. He bolted all 3 layers together, creating a door that was 5 inches thick and weighed nearly 70 pounds. The thickness provided excellent insulation, but the real innovation was the seal. Lars created a rabbet joint around the door frame, a stepped recess that the door would close into rather than against. When closed, the door face sat recessed 1/2 inch into the frame, surrounded on 3 sides by wood. He lined the rabbet joint with strips of wool, felt he had salvaged from an old coat, creating a compressible seal. For hinges, he used heavy strap iron he had purchased in Chamberlain. The hinges were mounted with bolts that went completely through the door frame timbers and were clinched on the back side. To tear the hinges free, someone would need to destroy the frame itself. The door swung outward, a crucial detail. Snow accumulating inside the entrance tunnel would make an inward swinging door difficult to open. An outward swinging door would push snow aside. The locking mechanism was simple but effective. A heavy wooden bar on the interior dropped into iron brackets on either side of the door, spanning the width. For exterior access, Lars created a small access port at waist height. He could reach through, lift the bar, and enter. The port had its own small cover, held closed by a wooden peg from inside. The system allowed him to secure the door from inside while still being able to enter from outside when necessary. The chimney presented different challenges. It needed to draw smoke efficiently while preventing downdrafts and minimizing heat loss. Lars positioned his cast-iron stove against the back wall of the chamber, farthest from the entrance. The stove's flue pipe extended upward, and Lars had to create a passage through the earth covering for it to exit. He used clay pipe sections, 4 inches in diameter, stacking them vertically above the stove. The pipe extended through the earth covering and projected 3 feet above the surface. This height ensured adequate draft and prevented snow from blocking the opening. Around the pipe, where it penetrated the earth covering, Lars packed clay mixed with sand to create a fireproof seal. The clay would insulate the pipe and prevent heat loss through the roof penetration. Inside the chamber, Lars built a heat shelf. This was a horizontal baffle positioned in the flue pipe about 3 feet above the stove. The shelf forced smoke to take a longer path, giving heat more time to transfer to the surrounding masonry before exiting. The principle was simple. Every moment smoke stayed inside was a moment its heat was captured rather than lost. The earth covering over Lars's shelter required careful layering to achieve waterproofing, insulation, and structural stability. He began with the 2 feet of packed earth he had already placed over the metal arch and excavated chamber. This base layer provided thermal mass and distributed weight evenly across the structure. Now he needed to ensure water would never penetrate to the interior. Over the packed earth, Lars laid his tar paper in overlapping sheets. He started at the lowest point near the entrance and worked upward, ensuring each sheet overlapped the one below by at least 6 inches. Water running down the slope would flow over the seams rather than under them. At the edges, he extended the tar paper beyond the earth covering and folded it down the sides of the structure, creating a continuous waterproof membrane. The tar paper was fragile and required protection from punctures and UV exposure. Lars's solution was a layer of clay. He mixed prairie clay with water to create a thick slurry and spread it over the tar paper in a 1-inch layer. He worked the clay carefully, ensuring complete coverage without tearing the paper beneath. The clay would dry hard, providing a protective shell over the waterproofing. Over the clay layer, he added 6 inches of mixed soil. This wasn't the heavy clay from excavation, but a lighter mixture of topsoil, sand, and organic matter. The layer provided additional insulation and created a growing medium for the final component of his roof system. The sod bricks Lars had carefully removed and stacked during excavation were now dry but still viable. He laid them grass side up across the entire roof surface, fitting them tightly together like puzzle pieces. The roots were still alive, dormant, but capable of regrowth. When spring came, the grass would regenerate, creating a living roof that would hold soil in place, absorb water, and provide additional insulation. He watered the sod lightly to encourage root establishment. Within the protective earth layers, sheltered from wind and extreme temperature, the grass roots would knit together over winter, creating a continuous mat. By summer, the roof would be indistinguishable from the surrounding prairie, covered in native grass that required no maintenance. The entire roof system, from metal arch to grass surface, totaled approximately 30 inches of layered materials. Each layer served multiple purposes. The earth provided thermal mass and structural support. The tar paper prevented water infiltration. The clay protected the tar paper and added insulation. The soil supported plant growth. The sod held everything in place and completed the insulation package. Lars shaped the roof to drain properly, creating a gentle slope from back to front. Water would run toward the entrance and away from the structure rather than pooling on top. He carved shallow channels at the edges to direct runoff away from the entrance area. The drainage system was passive, requiring no maintenance, relying on gravity and careful grading. When finished, the structure was nearly invisible from a distance. The roof blended with the hillside, appearing as a natural contour rather than a human-made shelter. Only the entrance, with its metal arch and wooden door, indicated anything unusual existed in the hillside. News of Lars's construction project had spread through the scattered homesteader community during the months he worked. Neighbors traveling past his claim had seen the excavation and the strange metal arch taking shape. By January of 1880, when Lars finally moved into his completed shelter, curiosity had turned to mockery. Gunnar Thorstad, who lived 6 miles east, was the most vocal critic. He visited Lars in mid-January and stood outside the entrance, shaking his head at what he saw. The metal arch protruding from the hillside looked odd, industrial, completely unlike traditional homesteader construction. Gunnar asked how much Lars had spent on the metal alone. When Lars admitted $28, Gunnar laughed. That money could have purchased a winter's worth of supplies or livestock. Instead, it had been wasted on metal that would rust underground within 2 years. Gunnar coined the name that would stick. He called it Hendrikson's Metal Grave, suggesting Lars had built himself a tomb rather than a home. The name spread quickly. Other homesteaders adopted it, sometimes with affection, but often with genuine concern that Lars had lost his mind after his brother's death. The concerns weren't entirely unfair. Lars's shelter did look strange. The entrance tunnel was dark and narrow. The earth covering made the structure appear buried, funereal. Most homesteaders built above-ground cabins, if they could afford it, viewing dugouts as temporary poverty shelters. Lars had intentionally built deeper underground, which seemed like moving backward rather than forward. Silas Wardell, who operated the trading post at Chamberlain, heard about the construction and mentioned it to other customers as an example of poor frontier judgment. A homesteader spending money on metal and tar paper instead of seed or livestock was making a fundamental mistake. Survival required focusing on production, crops, animals, things that generated income. Lars had invested in shelter that produced nothing. Even Otto Kraus, a German homesteader who lived 12 miles south and generally respected Lars's competence, questioned the design. Otto visited in late January and examined the structure carefully. He acknowledged the craftsmanship was excellent and the concept was interesting, but he worried about the risks. What if the earth covering collapsed? What if the metal rusted through? What if moisture accumulated inside and created worse conditions than a standard dugout? Otto's concerns were reasonable, based on engineering principles, but they reflected an unwillingness to trust an unproven design. Lars didn't argue with any of them. He understood their skepticism. He had invested significant time, money, and effort into a design that had never been tested. If it failed, he would lose everything and have to start over. The mockery hurt, but he also knew that words didn't matter. Results would answer all criticism. Inside his shelter, Lars began the real test. He had moved in on January 8, 1880, when the structure was complete. The interior was dark, illuminated only by light from his mica window and the door when open. But it was dry. The earth walls showed no condensation. The floor, covered with wooden planks he had laid over gravel, stayed completely dry. The temperature was remarkable. Outside, January temperatures dropped below zero regularly. Inside, without any fire burning, the temperature held at 48 degrees. When Lars lit his cast-iron stove, using a small amount of wood, the temperature climbed to 55 degrees within an hour and stayed there for half a day after the fire went out. Lars began documenting temperatures systematically in mid-January. He recorded 3 measurements daily: outside air temperature at dawn, interior temperature before lighting any fire, and interior temperature with a small fire burning in his stove. The pattern that emerged over the following weeks validated everything he had theorized about Earth insulation and thermal mass. On January 20th, the outside temperature at dawn was negative 12 degrees. Inside, before lighting a fire, the temperature was 49 degrees, a difference of 61 degrees maintained by the Earth covering alone. Lars lit a fire using 4 small pieces of cottonwood, approximately 1/8 of the wood he would have burned in his old dugout for the same heating period. Within 90 minutes, the interior temperature reached 54 degrees. He let the fire burn out completely. 6 hours later, the interior temperature was still 52 degrees. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth absorbed heat from the fire and released it slowly. The space didn't cool rapidly the way his old dugout had. Instead, it maintained stable temperatures for extended periods. On January 27th, a severe cold snap pushed outside temperatures to negative 31 degrees. Lars worried this might reveal weaknesses in his design. He took his morning temperature reading before lighting any fire. 51 degrees interior. The earth insulation was protecting him from negative 31-degree air with only a 2-degree temperature drop from his baseline. He lit a fire, and the interior quickly reached 55 degrees where it remained stable. The moisture problem that plagued traditional dugouts was absent. Lars examined his walls daily, expecting to find condensation, but the surfaces stayed dry. He realized the multiple layers of his construction were preventing moisture infiltration from outside, while the earth itself wicked away any moisture generated inside from breathing or cooking. The clay layer in his insulation system was particularly effective at managing moisture transfer. His firewood consumption was remarkably low. In a typical day, Lars burned approximately 1/4 of the wood he had used in his old dugout. Over a week, he used less than a tenth of a cord. At that rate, the 2 cords of wood he had stockpiled for winter would last the entire season with surplus remaining. The door seal performed excellently. Even during high wind events, no drafts penetrated the interior. The thick door with its felt seal and rabbet joint created an airtight barrier. When Lars opened the door on cold mornings, he could see the temperature differential visually. Cold air poured in and sank to the floor, while warm air escaped out the top of the doorway. But once closed, the seal prevented any exchange. The chimney draft worked perfectly. Smoke exited efficiently with no backdraft problems. The heat shelf he had built in the flue captured significant heat before smoke reached the exterior. He could hold his hand near the clay pipe inside the shelter and feel radiant heat that would have been lost with a straight flue design. By the end of January, Lars had proven his design worked in severe conditions. But he kept the results private, continuing his documentation without sharing details with skeptical neighbors. He wanted a full winter of data before making any claims. The blizzard that would validate Lars's design arrived on February 9, 1880. Weather patterns had been unsettled for several days, with temperatures fluctuating and wind shifting unpredictably. Experienced plainsmen recognized the signs of a major storm building. Lars secured his livestock, stocked his shelter with water and firewood, and prepared to wait it out. The storm hit at midday with terrifying intensity. Wind reached speeds that made standing outside impossible. Snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to a few feet. Temperature plunged to -28 degrees, and the wind chill made exposed skin freeze in under a minute. The blizzard continued without pause for 3 full days. Inside his shelter, Lars was comfortable. He maintained a small fire in his stove, burning wood sparingly. The interior temperature held at 53 degrees throughout the storm. He could hear wind screaming across the prairie above him, but inside, the air was still and quiet. The earth covering absorbed and muffled sound. The metal arch entrance showed no signs of stress or infiltration, despite the howling wind directly outside. He spent the 3 days reading, doing minor maintenance tasks, and monitoring his temperature log. The storm was severe, but it wasn't a crisis for him. He had adequate food, water, and fuel. The shelter protected him completely. He knew neighbors in traditional cabins and dugouts would be struggling desperately, burning wood continuously, fighting drafts and cold, but he was simply waiting in relative comfort. On February 12th, the storm finally broke. Lars opened his door to find snow drifted to 5 feet deep in places. The entrance to his shelter had drifted partially closed, but the outward swinging door pushed through the snow easily. The metal arch had shed most accumulation due to its curved shape. What snow had stuck was already beginning to slide off as the sun appeared. Lars dug out his entrance area and checked on his livestock. His horses had survived in a rough shelter he had built near the creek, though they were hungry and stressed. He fed them from his hay supply and began the work of clearing paths and restoring normal routines. That afternoon he saw a figure approaching across the snow-covered prairie. It was Gunnar Thorstad, traveling on snowshoes. Gunnar looked exhausted, his face wind-burned and haggard. He had come to check if Lars had survived the blizzard, half expecting to find him dead in his metal grave. Gunnar's astonishment was visible when Lars greeted him, looking rested and healthy. Lars invited him inside. Gunnar entered the shelter cautiously, as if expecting to find disaster. Instead, he found a warm, dry, comfortable space. Lars still had a fire burning in his stove, though it was small. The interior temperature was 55 degrees. Gunnar, coming from 3 days of desperate cold in his own dugout, stood in stunned silence. Lars made coffee and they talked. Gunnar described his experience during the storm. He had burned through more than a cord of wood trying to keep his dugout above freezing. He had stuffed every gap with rags and blankets. Despite his efforts, interior temperatures had dropped into the 20s. His family had survived by huddling together under every blanket they owned. Gunnar stayed for 2 hours, examining every aspect of Lars's shelter with the intensity of a man confronting something that challenged his understanding of how frontier life worked. He touched the earth walls, noting they were dry. He examined the door seal, seeing how the rabbet joint and felt created an airtight barrier. He studied the metal arch entrance, running his hands along the corrugated surface, checking for rust or deterioration. He found none. Lars explained his design patiently. The earth covering provided constant insulation. The metal arch created a structurally sound entrance that wouldn't rot or collapse. The multiple layers of waterproofing kept moisture out. The thermal mass of surrounding earth stabilized temperature. The efficient stove minimized fuel consumption. Every element worked together to create a system that maintained livable conditions with minimal effort. Gunnar listened carefully, asking technical questions about construction methods and materials costs. When Lars explained he had spent approximately $60 total on the shelter, including metal, hardware, tar paper, stove, and all materials, Gunnar was surprised. That was expensive compared to a traditional dugout, but reasonable for a structure that performed this well and would last decades. Before leaving, Gunnar asked a direct question. If he wanted to build a similar shelter next summer, would Lars help him understand the design? Lars agreed immediately. He wasn't keeping the design secret. If others could benefit from what he had learned, that was valuable. Gunnar departed, struggling back through deep snow toward his own claim, but his attitude toward Lars's metal grave had changed completely. 3 days later, another visitor arrived. Amos Fletcher was a cattle rancher who lived 15 miles northwest. Lars knew him slightly from occasional encounters in Chamberlain, but had never visited his ranch. Amos arrived leading a horse with his wife and 2 small children bundled in blankets on its back. They looked desperate. Amos explained quickly. During the blizzard, their cabin's chimney had caught fire. The wooden structure had been damaged severely. The family had survived, but their cabin was now uninhabitable in winter conditions. They had spent the last 2 nights in their barn with the livestock. Amos had heard about Lars's unusual shelter from Gunnar Thorstad and had come to ask for temporary refuge until they could make repairs. Lars welcomed them without hesitation. His shelter wasn't large, but it could accommodate 5 people. He set his wife and children near the stove where it was warmest. They were cold, but not dangerously so. Amos looked around the interior, seeing immediately how different it was from any frontier dwelling he had encountered. The Fletcher family stayed for 4 days. During that time, Amos helped Lars with daily chores and observed how the shelter functioned. The interior remained comfortable throughout their stay despite housing 5 people instead of 1. The stove, burning modest amounts of wood, kept everyone warm. There was no dampness, no drafts, no cold spots. The children, initially frightened by the unusual earth-covered structure, adjusted quickly and played quietly in the warm space. Spring of 1880 brought a subtle but significant shift in how homesteaders in the region viewed Lars's design. Amos Fletcher returned to his ranch and spent the summer rebuilding his cabin, but he modified his design based on what he had observed. He couldn't afford corrugated metal, but he incorporated earth berming around 3 sides of his cabin and added 2 feet of sod to his roof. The modifications improved his structure's thermal performance noticeably. Gunnar Thorstad began planning his own earth-covered shelter. He visited Lars multiple times during the summer, taking measurements and asking detailed questions. Gunnar had access to some corrugated metal through a railroad contact and planned to build a shelter similar to Lars's design but modified for his specific site conditions. By fall, Gunnar had completed his structure. It wasn't identical to Lars's, but it used the same principles. Otto Kraus, the German homesteader who had been skeptical, approached Lars in June with technical questions. Otto had engineering training from his time in Germany and wanted to understand the structural calculations behind the arch design. Lars explained his observations and reasoning, acknowledging he hadn't used formal engineering but had relied on practical observation of railroad construction. Otto respected that approach and began designing his own variation. Word spread through informal networks. Homesteaders talked at trading posts, at occasional social gatherings, during chance encounters on the prairie. The story of the blizzard validation was particularly compelling. A man who had sat comfortably inside while neighbors struggled to survive made people reconsider their assumptions about shelter design. By 1881, 4 additional earth-covered shelters had been built in the region using variations of Lars's principles. Some used metal arches. Others used stone or heavy timber for entrance structures but incorporated the earth-covering concept. The specific materials varied based on availability and budget, but the core idea surrounding living space with earth insulation was consistent. The designs weren't identical. Each builder adapted the concept to their circumstances. A homesteader near a limestone outcrop used stacked stone for his entrance structure. A family with carpentry skills built a heavy timber frame entrance. Some made their shelters smaller to reduce construction time. Others built larger, incorporating separate rooms. But they all shared the fundamental innovation, using Earth's thermal mass for climate control. Lars continued improving his own shelter. He added a second room by extending his excavation and creating an interior doorway. He built furniture suited to the space. He experimented with ventilation, adding a second small vent to improve air circulation during summer. The structure required almost no maintenance. The metal showed no rust due to his linseed oil treatment. The roof remained waterproof. The door seal stayed tight. His fuel consumption remained remarkably low. During the winter of 1880 to 1881, Lars burned less than 1.5 cords of wood compared to the 3 to 5 cords typical homesteaders consumed. The savings in labor and wood-gathering time allowed him to focus on improving his farm and livestock operations. Lars Hendrickson continued farming his Dakota Territory claim through the 1880s and into the 90s. He never married after Emil's death, living alone in the shelter he had built. He became known as a competent farmer and a source of practical knowledge about earth-sheltered construction. Homesteaders continued seeking his advice for decades after his initial design. By 1890, earth-covered shelters had spread beyond the immediate region. Travelers and migrants passing through saw the designs and carried the ideas to new territories. The concept appeared in Montana, Wyoming, and western Nebraska, adapted to local conditions and materials. The specific attribution to Lars faded as the design became common knowledge. But the innovation persisted. The United States Army noticed the design's effectiveness and incorporated similar principles into some frontier post construction. Semi-subterranean powder magazines and storage facilities used earth covering for temperature control and protection. The military applications were different from Lars's residential design, but the underlying physics were identical. Professional architects began studying vernacular frontier designs in the early 1900s, documenting structures that demonstrated practical innovation. Several researchers visited Dakota Territory and documented earth-covered shelters, though Lars's original structure wasn't specifically identified in most records. The academic interest validated what frontier settlers had learned through necessity. Earth insulation was extraordinarily effective for climate control. Lars died in 1903 at age 51 from pneumonia, a bitter irony given his brother's death from the same disease. He was buried on his claim near Emil's grave. His shelter remained intact and was occupied by subsequent homesteaders who acquired the property. The structure lasted until the 1920s, when it was finally abandoned, not due to failure, but because changing agricultural economics made the small claim unviable. Modern earth-sheltered architecture owes more to frontier innovations like Lars's than most architects acknowledge. The principles he discovered through observation and experimentation, thermal mass, earth insulation, proper waterproofing, structural arch shapes, are identical to those used in contemporary sustainable design. The specific materials have changed, but the physics remain constant. Several of the earth-covered shelters built in the 1880s using Lars's principles still exist as ruins. Archaeologists have studied them, noting the sophisticated construction methods and durability. One shelter documented in western Montana showed no structural failure after 70 years of abandonment, remarkable for any frontier construction. The story of Lars Hendrickson represents a particular type of frontier innovation, born from tragedy, developed through systematic observation, executed with available materials, and shared freely with others who needed it. He didn't seek recognition or profit. He solved a problem that had killed his brother, and made that solution available to anyone who wanted to learn from it. His impossible invention, a shelter that stayed warm with minimal fuel, that required almost no maintenance, that could be built by a single person with basic tools, became routine. The metal grave became a proven survival technology that saved lives and improved living conditions across the northern plains.